It is seen as one of America's biggest mistakes, and in some ways it is. Prohibition created a great conflict in American history. It set the American people and its government against each other, and the results of this conflict would have many effects. Although the 18th Amendment, also known as Prohibition, was passed with the thought that it would prevent illegal actions, corruption, and the general ugliness caused by alcohol, it did the opposite, leading towards a shift in society that had large and long-range ramifications. The prohibition of alcohol was not an idea that came about suddenly. It was a gradual process that was fueled greatly by the temperance movement. The temperance ideals were heavily based in the Christian religion and were spread substantially by preachers who believed that one should worship the Bible, not the bottle. This movement actually began in the late 1600s and early 1700s, when laws forbidding public drinking houses from being opened on Sundays began to be passed, in addition to the laws against drunken disorderliness. Women, although they had not yet gained the right to vote, influenced this movement greatly, forming several temperance groups, the most prominent being the Women's Christian Temperance Union in 1874 and the Anti-Saloon League in 1895. Most women during this time were housewives, relying solely on their husband's income, and therefore greatly affected by his consumption of alcohol, which often siphoned a great deal of money from their income and launched a number of families into poverty. Women's groups such as WCTU were actually among the first to send lobbyists into Washington, D.C. to advocate their cause. It was the increased pressure on the politicians and the still spreading temperance movement that finally got the 18th Amendment drafted. Although the temperance movement was widespread, particularly in the South, it was by no means the only opinion on the issue of alcohol. By 1915, the country had split into two distinct groups, the Dries, who called for the prohibition of alcohol, and the Wets, who were set against it. Although there are a number of people against prohibition, they lacked the organization of the temperance movement, and therefore failed to make an impression on those in Washington, D.C. The 18th Amendment to the Constitution was proposed on December 18, 1917, but did not get the three-quarters vote for ratification until January 16, 1919, when Wyoming voted yes to the amendment. The 18th Amendment stated that 1 year after its ratification, the manufacture, sale, transportation, importation, and exportation of intoxicating liquors in the United States and territories under its jurisdiction was prohibited. Although the 18th Amendment prohibited the consumption of intoxicating liquors, it did not specify exactly what an intoxicating liquor was. The National Prohibition Act, which was written by Andrew Volstead, an influential Republican leader in the House of Representatives, outlined exactly what was to be prohibited by the 18th Amendment and how it was to be enforced. This act stated that any beverage which contained 0.5% of alcohol or more was an intoxicating liquor and thus illegal. However, it also made an exception for wine used for sacramental purposes and liquor used for medicinal purposes, provided that in both these instances a permit for the alcohol had been obtained from the Commissioner of Internal Revenue. Shortly after Prohibition went into effect on July 1, 1920, criminals and racketeers could be seen forming around the new and profitable business of selling smuggled liquor and home-brewed spirits. It was because of this business that a new, organized crime began to take shape. In addition to selling illegal alcohol, large crime organizations, like the infamous Al Capones, had numbers of speakeasies, which were underground establishments based almost solely on the fact that you could buy and drink alcohol there. Despite their blatant disrespect towards the law, most establishments and organizations avoided being brought to justice by bribing public officials with the lucrative profits Prohibition had bestowed upon them. By 1927, it was clear that Prohibition wasn't working. It can be seen now that the government did not invest anywhere near enough funds or agents to properly enforce the 18th Amendment. Speakeasies had run rampant, spreading to nearly every block in any major city. People could be seen carrying hip flasks and hiding alcohol in their homes in any place they could find. Yet despite all this, the U.S. government still refused to admit Prohibition was a failure or send any more law enforcement to support the 18th Amendment. Throughout this time, the political group of the Wets were organizing their ranks, and finally, in the form of the Association Against the Prohibition Amendment, they made 24 charges as to why Prohibition should be repealed. Unfortunately, the Dries had lost none of their organizational skills, and right after the charges were released, the WCTU published a pamphlet saying why all their charges were false. This was just the beginning of the uphill battle between the Wets and Dries as to whether or not Prohibition was to be repealed. At this point in time, it was unknown as to whether or not it was even possible to repeal the 18th Amendment. After all, it was an amendment to the Constitution, and it was final word, which is why it was so difficult to have passed in the first place. It wouldn't be until 1933, while the Great Depression was ravaging the country, that the 18th Amendment would finally be repealed, with the ratification of the 21st Amendment. The 21st Amendment completely nullified the 18th, exemplifying the American resolve to rectify its mistakes and the resiliency of the Constitution. Prohibition has left a footprint on the world today, and is often seen as America's biggest failing in that it caused crime, corruption, and a disrespect for the law to rise, all the things that Prohibition was supposed to prevent. During this era, there was a great conflict between the government and the people, a conflict that has never been fully resolved. Organized crime and the consumption of alcohol has never gone back to the way it was prior to Prohibition, and a disrespect for the government and its laws can still be seen in society today. Prohibition can be seen as one of America's greatest conflicts within itself, and it shows that while mistakes can be remedied, there will always be scars left behind.